So the question I want to talk about in this video is when you are self-hosting your own e-commerce store on WordPress through FluentCart, WooCommerce, Easy Digital Downloads, any of these things, and you connect to Stripe, are you unwittingly sharing your store's internal information, such as customer names and emails and transactions, with a third party without realizing that you're doing it? This has been something that's been an item of discussion now for a few years, and I want to address it here in this video. Now, the first time I personally heard about this issue was back when Easy Digital Downloads was acquired by Automotive. And I do remember it being an item of discussion. I remember Carl Hancock, who's the founder of Gravity Forms, putting out on X, and he was basically lamenting that these plugin developers who were using Easy Digital Downloads in order to sell their plugins were now in a position where Automotive essentially had inside access to their sales data. And I think about the competitor research that could come from that. And I remember the discussion. I remember people discussing it online. I also remember having a conversation with Adam Preiser, who's the founder of SureCart, about it. And he said that it was indeed true. Now, I will say I remained skeptical about it. It was mainly because I felt as if it was being said in an generalized way. And secondly, the people that were talking about it were in a competitor relationship, okay? In that SureCart obviously is a competitor to many of the other plugins out there in the space, that a lot of these plugin developers now find themselves in a competitor situation with Automotive. It was just one of those things that I took it with a grain of salt. And frankly, I didn't look into it further. Okay. Now, it more recently came up in a discussion on Facebook with the launch of FluentCart. And it had to do with somebody that I do not know who was basically saying that essentially he was mentioning the idea of privacy when it comes to self-hosting your own shopping cart. And that was one of the things that he liked. So we got WooCommerce, FluentCart, anything that runs inside of WordPress. And Adam, once again, came into that conversation and basically shattered the illusion and said that there really is no privacy when you're running a self-hosted shopping cart, as long as you're connecting to Stripe. Okay. And I will say, yet again, I kind of argued with him in a nice way, because I really like Adam. I respect the hell out of the software tools that his companies have developed. But that being said, it was still that old grain of salt coming to mind in my case, because he is a competitor. He has a competitor relationship with WP Managed Ninja that's putting out FluentCart. I mean, they are competing packages. And so I kind of questioned the motives there a little bit. And frankly, I had not looked into it. It also didn't make a ton of sense that Stripe would do that. Why would Stripe expose that information to people when they didn't really need it? And so I was skeptical. But once again, Adam was pretty adamant about it. He said that it is indeed true. And I'm not going to come out and call the guy a liar, because the truth is, I didn't know. Okay, I did not know what the situation was. I do not develop shopping cart software. I don't develop a Stripe payment gateway plugin. I'm an end user, essentially. Even though I manage a lot of sites for clients, I'm an end user. Okay, so I'm not in a position where I am a Stripe verified partner. I don't have a Stripe platform account. And so I don't know. I can't go into one of these accounts and personally look. All I could do is do my own research and talk to people. So I discussed it with Adam, and I did talk to a few other people as well. And I did my own research. I dived into the Stripe documentation. I had a few chats with ChatGPT and Grok. And I think I've got it figured out. I mean, it's not really a big mystery. That's the interesting thing, is when you really get down to it, the data is all out there. It's just that a lot of us were sort of glossing over and not paying attention. I will say it's also not, frankly, that big of a deal, but it is something that you should know about and take it into, the formula with which you think and you decide on what platforms to use. Okay, so here's what the issue is. When you connect your self-hosted shopping cart to Stripe, there's one of two ways that you're going to go. The first one is the one that I was always used to, which is that you go into your Stripe account and you get your API keys, you plug them into WordPress, and you connect through your API keys. Okay, so you're going to have a public key and you're going to have a secret key. You also have a set of the same for your test mode for Stripe, and you plug them in there and you're good to go. Now, as you probably have noticed, that most of the plugins out there these days that connect to Stripe are no longer offering that option. They're sort of phasing it out and they're moving over to what's called Stripe Connect. Okay, this is where you go and you hit a button, you go over to Stripe, and you hit the button, you basically accept the permissions and connect, and then it goes right back into your shopping cart again. And so it's a one-click connection, nice and easy, and frankly, it's a lot more secure because you're no longer copying and pasting API keys. And more importantly, you're not putting those API keys potentially right into the WordPress database. That's something we'll talk about here in a little bit. So the issue comes down to the usage of Stripe Connect and how it actually works. Now, when you go and you connect, say, WooCommerce to Stripe, you're going to come up to this thing that says select which account you'd like to connect to WooCommerce Incorporated. Okay, and it says WooCommerce Inc. will be able to see your account data, such as all payment and payout history, including any data created by other businesses you've connected. They'll also be able to create new payments and take other actions for you. And you hit connect and you are good to go. Now that is standard verbiage. If you go and you connect FluentCart, it's going to say the exact same thing. It's just going to reference FluentCart Incorporated. But now do notice how it's not the name of the plugin or the software, but it's actually stating the name of the actual corporation, the name of the company, the developer themselves that's going to be able to see that information. Really, and Adam made this point in the Facebook group. It's literally Stripe is telling you that. It's just that most of us are reading it and just agreeing to it and not really, frankly, taking it literally. And that's true, I will admit, okay? So it's standard verbiage, and so that opens up the case of, well, what can these people see? Okay, what can WooCommerce Inc. or FluentCart Inc. or in the case back in 2021 with Easy Digital Downloads, what can Awesome Motive now potentially see if they took over the Stripe account? Well, they can see a fair amount from what I can gather. They can see customer names. They can see customer email addresses. They can see the transactions. Now, they're not going to see everything. They don't have full access to your account. They can't see credit card numbers. There is information they can't see, but they can see something, and they can get some aggregate data as well as to your sales volume. And so it's not nothing. They can definitely see that, okay? So that once again brings me back to the old discussion with regard to Easy Digital Downloads. The concern there was legitimate. They are able to see us. So the way that it works is that there's what's called a Stripe platform account. That when you are a Stripe verified partner and you're working with Stripe, there's certain policies that you have to work with. And Stripe is requiring these developers to now use Stripe Connect. They're basically phasing out the old usage of API keys. Now, it just so happens that the way Stripe Connect works is that developer has a Stripe platform account. It's essentially the main account, okay? And then when you come in there and you connect your account to that account, you become what's called a connected account underneath that platform account, okay? And that means that you've basically just granted some permissions to the platform, okay? Now, it makes perfect sense because in a lot of cases when you connect to these platforms, it's because they're supposed to be able to operate operations on your Stripe account on your behalf. Things like making charges, issuing refunds, things like that. It makes perfect sense. But those of us who are running self-hosted stores, we think, well, you're just sharing it with the software. But no, just like when you are running transactions into your own Stripe account, you see the information inside of WordPress, inside your store, but if you log in and go to your Stripe dashboard, you can see it there too. Well, the Stripe platform account owners can do the same thing for connected accounts beneath their account. And so the data is there and it is viewable by them. Okay, so the data is there. It could be viewable. All right, so the question is this a bad thing? Is it something that one needs to really worry about? The truth of the matter is that the Stripe Connect approach, the Stripe Connect method of connecting to Stripe is definitely a more secure way to go. There's a reason why they're pushing anybody who makes software that connects to Stripe to utilize Stripe Connect. It is definitely more secure than manually plugging in API keys. There's no doubt about it. That being said, we have to look at what Stripe Connect was also built for. Stripe Connect was originally built for, from my understanding, of course, for SaaS applications, so that's software as a service, and marketplace type setups, okay? Where, of course, you're running it through these accounts, this remotely hosted software. It's basically, there's not really an expectation of privacy for that type of thing because you are using remotely hosted shopping carts and all that type of thing. Now, when it comes to WordPress plugins, stuff that we self-host ourselves, some may have different expectations. You may think that you've got that sense of privacy. Now, I will say I never personally had that idea of privacy with regard to a self-hosted shopping cart because I realized that the moment you connect your self-hosted site to almost any external service, but certainly a payment processor, you're sending the data someplace. So it's not as if that's a fully private situation by its very nature, okay? But I think where some people may find themselves surprised is the fact that an additional party beyond Stripe themselves could also view that data as well. What seems like is happening is that Stripe Connect was originally built for certain types of platforms so that that platform can do things, okay? Like it can do split payments, it can control the payment system. You can even do a transaction fee. Like when you go with WooCommerce and you use their Woo payments setup, you're essentially using Stripe behind the scenes. That you're getting into their platform account and you're going through that. And they did that so that they can make it nice and simple, and it's all baked right into WooCommerce. That's how Woo payments works. But there is not currently another method of Stripe Connect available to developers that does not have this capability. There is no way that Stripe offers, and to my knowledge, developers have asked for it, where you could do something as easy and user-friendly and secure as Stripe Connect, but not expose the transactions to the account holder. That is something I think Stripe should fix. It's again, in the real world, it's probably not that big of a deal. It even has benefits with regard to the ability for these hosted applications and marketplaces to be able to support their customers and find out things that are going on with those transactions. But WordPress plugins don't really need that information. There's no actual reason why they need to be able to view it. In the real world, I bet you barely any of them ever do. But the point is, they could. And I think most of them would be perfectly willing to not even have that capability. But yet, Stripe is not providing the option to them. And it's there, and it's something that one should be aware of, especially if you might find yourself as a plugin seller who now has a company potentially such as Automotive that can now potentially see your internal sales data. Now, obviously, one question that may be asked is, does this present any legal issues, such as GDPR, privacy policies, things like that? And I'll be the first to say I am not a lawyer. I also don't pretend to be one. So take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt, but this is the best that I can tell. Obviously, if you're using Stripe Connect, it does potentially open up certain data available to an additional third party. That third party is the developer of the payment gateway that you are using to connect to Stripe. Okay, so technically speaking, you should probably disclose that on your site's privacy policy. That's the main thing. When it comes to agreements that are in place. I forgot what they were called off the top of my head, but basically that Stripe is the data processor for the orders. They've got their own policies already set up. I believe it's all GDPR compliant by its very nature. To my knowledge, again, I am not a lawyer. I think you're okay, but I do think the best way to handle it would probably be to just simply include in your privacy policy for your site, wherever it is that you mention that sales information is being sent to Stripe as the data processor. You probably also want to mention the developer of your payment gateway, because even though they're probably never looking at it, they can technically see it as well. So you should probably go ahead and mention that. That's the best that I can tell, but feel free to look into it further. Now, how can you avoid this if you were so inclined to avoid it? Okay. The truth is, the only way to really do it is to connect directly to Stripe, directly to your own account using your API keys. And then at that point, you're not sharing data with anybody other than Stripe themselves, of course. Now, here's the thing. That's a lot harder to do than it used to be. It used to be the standard approach to connecting to Stripe was to plug in your API keys. Now, not so much. And it's because of the policies of Stripe themselves. Are actually basically moving the industry toward Stripe Connect for security reasons. And so it's becoming harder and harder to find shopping carts and payment gateway plugins for WordPress that do not use Stripe Connect. And frankly, it's sort of the way that it should be. So, but there are still some ways, in fact, FluentCart is one of them, where you could still do it using API keys if you're so inclined. And obviously, when you own the store, you can kind of do what you want. I mean, if you want to expose your account like that, you absolutely can. And I believe that you should have the right to do it. All right. But let's talk about storing API keys inside of WordPress. There are risks associated with that. Again, depending on how they're stored. Because the truth is, if somebody else that is a bad actor was able to access those API keys, they can do a lot of damage. And in fact, there was a pretty well-known post that I went through where a lady was basically out $70,000 because somebody else gained access to their Stripe account, okay? And it looked to me like it was because that person managed to get the API keys. Now, how could that happen? Well, if the API keys are stored inside of WordPress, especially in the database, in plain text format, that's a massive security problem. If you could go into WordPress and you could go to your Stripe settings and you could see your API keys, you got yourself a massive, massive issue right there. Because there are security issues with WordPress. I mean, it's not like WordPress is Swiss cheese, but let's face it, security issues do happen. Sometimes you have really crappy plugins, cheap crap out of the repository that just opens up security holes and nothing ever gets fixed. Every now and then you will find even really good quality plugins that find that there's a security hole that opens up some backdoor access or allows somebody to get administrator access to WordPress. And if your Stripe keys are sitting in there available for administrators to see, all bets are off. Okay. Now, FluentCart, they have the ability, if you want, to put the API keys into your WP config file. Now, this is certainly a hell of a lot better than putting it in the database, but it's still not foolproof. And I think they would be the first to tell you it's not. But again, it's your store. You should be able to do with it what you want, right? So it is better to put it into the config file, because even if somebody managed to get administrator access, they're not going to be able to see the internals of a PHP file like that. That being said, security issues can still happen that would enable people to get read access on files. And I've actually seen it happen before on Bluehost back in the day, on a couple of occasions actually, where I had a site get hacked into, and they were able to litter all kinds of shit all over the file system and everything. You know damn well they had access to the config file, okay? If they open up the config file, they've got access not only to keys that you've got in there, but they've got access to the what's called the salts, which could basically decrypt all the user stuff inside of WordPress, as well as the access information to your database. And so it's not any good. It's not the kind of thing that happens real often anymore. But if you are on cheap, crappy shared hosting, and you're on a server with a whole bunch of other people that's just a consumer thing, and you probably have other people on that server that aren't maintaining their sites properly and stuff like that. And then more importantly, the web host doesn't have a proper security environment where they're not putting each site into its own container and basically making them where no site can interact with each other. If they're not doing the proper security practices in that regard, there is a risk of bad actors getting actual access to something like WP config, and then there's your Stripe keys. Okay? Again, most good hosts operate in an environment where that's not possible, but the risk is not zero. Okay, so it's again something that you need to be aware of. There are security risks associated with putting your Stripe API keys inside of WordPress. Now, smart plugins, even if you were to enter the Stripe API keys, they will store them in an encrypted fashion. And so that reduces the risk by quite a bit. But again, not all of them are doing that. Nowadays, everybody's going towards Stripe Connect anyway, and so it makes the issue go moot. But even some of the ones that still allow you to do direct API key entry, you do want to make sure they're storing it in an encrypted fashion so that if somebody was able to get access to the raw data, they cannot get your API keys. One other quick word about those API keys, but see, part of the problem here with Stripe is that it's so large, it's so popular, that you have a lot of people that are not very technical who use Stripe, okay? And so when you have people who don't understand all the implications of the stuff, who are told to go and get their API keys, and you go to get the API keys in your Stripe account, and it's called the standard API keys, and they happen to be basically God mode. It basically means that it will enable anybody with those API keys to do almost anything they want with your account, okay? And so it doesn't have, in most cases, a reduced set of permissions. Now, so that is something that you can go and look at with Stripe. They do have another set of API keys, I believe it's called restricted, that you can do. You can also rotate your API keys so that periodically you go in there and you expire them and you put in new ones. They have various things that you can do inside your Stripe account to make it so that the potential damage that can be done if your API keys leak would be less, okay? Which is something that you should probably do if you do choose to connect directly for privacy purposes. That being said, I will say for most people, I would just use Stripe Connect. I mean, at the end of the day, even though a third party could look at that information through the platform, why would they in most cases? And it's a lot more secure. And I'd much rather have that one thing happen than to have a massive data breach because my Stripe API keys got out into the wild. Keep in mind, there's also other options besides Stripe. Everything we're talking about in this video is pretty much specific to Stripe. Now, if you are using another payment gateway, you have different considerations. Keep in mind that depending on the way those platforms work, you may have similar, possibly even worse issues than the way Stripe handles it. But every payment gateway and payment processor is going to be a little bit different. My understanding is that if you're using PayPal, even though you could do the same basic connection process, that they're not exposing the transactions through a platform account. My understanding is that PayPal doesn't work like that. There are other payment gateways as well, some of which you could probably also connect using API keys. Now, keep in mind, anytime you plug an API key into WordPress, you want to look into how it's actually being stored in the database. If it's not being stored in an encrypted fashion, that's a potential security hole, because if your site gets hacked, you've got a leakage of the API keys, and that will apply to anything, okay? And then there's also the going private option through like getting your own merchant account and then going with an independent gateway such as authorize.net or something like that. That is something you can do. In fact, it's the way that I did it before Stripe became really popular. I went with Stripe because it's so damn easy. Okay, but I used authorized.net in the past through my own merchant account that I have. And if you want complete privacy, as complete as possible, and still do e-commerce on your website, that's probably the way to go. Not only that, you're gonna get a higher level of customer service through the company that runs your merchant account. You might even have an account rep. I mean, it's a lot different experience than Stripe, where you're basically just one of multiple millions of people essentially using their merchant account, which is Stripe's. So sometimes you can get flagged for fraud when nothing weird happened. They could do weird lockouts on your account when nothing weird happened. And when you try to get help from them, it's going to often feel frustrating because there's nobody to call. You get emailed back canned responses, and it feels like you're not really being heard. And it can be really, really frustrating, especially when your money is on the line. But to Stripe, it's not that big of a deal because to them, you're still a little freaking ant, and they're a massive corporation. So again, if you don't like that kind of setup, you might want to consider getting your own merchant account and going a different route. So I'll just wrap up with this. Is this a big deal? All right. To some people, it might be, just because they're so privacy paranoid that it might really concern them that anybody could go in there and see this information. And if that's you, then you might need to look into getting your own gateway, something like that, or maybe just using Stripe, but doing it in a direct way using API keys, keeping in mind all those security implications that I talked about just a bit ago. But in the real world, I really don't think this is that big of a deal. Was I a little surprised by it? Yes. Does it concern me? No. In the real world, these WordPress plugin developers are just trying to put out a good plugin. Okay. When you're self-hosting their cart, you're generally not sending that data to the developer. Okay. It's not as if the developer is collecting information on their own servers about things that are going on in your store. In most cases, I'm not going to say all of them are not doing some telemetry like that, but something like FluentCart, for example, they're just not doing that. But it doesn't mean that if they were to go into their Stripe dashboard that they couldn't see it. Okay. And so it's just important that you know that the capability is there. And if that's a big deal to you, you act accordingly. Personally, I don't really care. And I don't think most of the WordPress developers care either. They're using Stripe Connect not for any spying purposes. They're using Stripe Connect for ease of use for the end user because it is far more secure, and frankly because Stripe is making them do it. Okay? And again, I want to remind you that Stripe is not giving these developers any other option. There is no other way to use this form of authorization and connection with Stripe without there being a platform account with connected accounts. And Stripe just has this setup where they're going to show that information if the person wanted to go look at it. There's nothing the developer can do about it. Okay? So if we're going to put pressure on anybody here, we should probably maybe put a little pressure on Stripe to offer a plan B. There should be a way to do the equivalent of Stripe Connect and not expose that information to companies where you have self-hosted software. For SaaS applications and marketplaces and those types of things, that the need is there in some cases for support purposes or what have you. But for WordPress self-hosted stuff, they don't need to see it, but yet we still want the security that comes along with Stripe Connect. And I think it would be really nice if Stripe would follow through and actually make that as a capability. I think it's probably a little bit more important than they probably think it is. At the end of the day, now that I have verified this for myself and researched it, I will no longer tell anybody else that they're overgeneralizing. Now I got it. All right. It's it's all a learning curve. I do this stuff day in and day out. And in the process of researching this one, I learned a little something. Now, does it change anything? Nah, Doesn't change anything. When I self-host a shopping cart like FluentCart or WooCommerce, I do it for data sovereignty purposes. I want to own the platform. I don't do it thinking the data is not going anywhere. I've been using Stripe long enough. I know the data goes someplace. It doesn't worry me. I just didn't know that there was another person who could see it. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change anything for me. And it shouldn't really, at the end of the day, change much for you either. I don't think this is anything to be paranoid about. But you do want to know what's happening. And at least now, when you see people talk about that, you know where they're coming from. And now I do too.